From secret VW Beetle stunt doubles to classical ballet inspirations, the making of Knight Rider was far stranger than the sci-fi show itself. Behind David Hasselhoff's flowing hair and KITT's sarcastic wit lay a world of damaged cars, hidden stunt drivers, and production secrets that would make even the most dedicated fan's scanner light flash with surprise. Here are 15 weird facts you didn't know about Knight Rider. 1982. Fact 1. KITT's stunt double was a Volkswagen Beetle. When Knight Rider needed to perform the most dangerous and destructive stunts, the production team had a secret weapon that would surprise even the most dedicated fans of the show. Behind all those spectacular jumps and crashes that made KITT look invincible was actually a Volkswagen Beetle disguised as the famous Trans Am. And the crew affectionately nicknamed this unusual stunt car the Flivver. The problem facing the Knight Rider production team was both practical and expensive. Every time they needed KITT to perform a particularly dangerous stunt that involved major impacts or the possibility of serious damage, they couldn't risk destroying one of their precious Pontiac Trans Ams. These cars were not only expensive to replace, but each one required about $18,000 worth of modifications to transform it into the high-tech KITT that audiences saw on screen. The production simply couldn't afford to keep destroying Trans Ams like candy every time a script called for KITT to crash through a wall or take a particularly hard landing. The solution they came up with was brilliantly simple and perfectly suited to 1980s Southern California. Volkswagen Beetles had been converted into dune buggies and sandrails for years, and these vehicles were legendary for their ability to handle jumps, hard landings, and general automotive abuse. Even better, if something broke on a Volkswagen, the parts were incredibly cheap and readily available everywhere. So, the production team built what was essentially a tube-framed Volkswagen sandrail, but designed it to fit the exact dimensions of a Pontiac Trans Am. The ingenious part was that they could then place one of the rubber KITT body shells they had already created over this Beetle-based chassis. From a distance, especially with television's limited resolution in the early 1980s, it looked exactly like KITT performing these death-defying stunts. The lightweight Beetle chassis could handle impacts and jumps that would have completely destroyed a real Trans Am. And when something did break, they could fix it quickly and cheaply with standard Volkswagen parts. Fact 2. The car's front end was always destroyed. If you watch Knight Rider carefully, you'll notice something strange about many of KITT's most spectacular jumping scenes. The camera almost always cuts away to show Michael Knight's face or switches to a different angle right before the car lands, and there's a very practical reason for this editing trick that reveals just how brutal the stunt work really was on the show. The truth is that KITT's front end was getting demolished on a regular basis during these jump sequences, and the production team had to hide the damage from viewers. When a 2-ton Pontiac Trans Am launches into the air and comes down hard on pavement or rough terrain, the front bumper, nose cone, and headlight assembly take an enormous beating. The cars weren't designed to handle the kind of punishment that Knight Rider's scripts demanded week after week. And even with the best stunt drivers in the business, the laws of physics meant that most landings resulted in significant damage to the front of the vehicle. The show's editors became masters at disguising this problem through careful camera work and strategic cuts. They would film the car launching into the air from one angle, then quickly switch to a shot of David Hasselhoff gripping the steering wheel or reacting to the jump. And by the time they cut back to show KITT driving away, they had switched to using a different, undamaged car. This sleight of hand happened so smoothly that most viewers never noticed the technique. But it was absolutely essential to maintaining the illusion that KITT was the indestructible supercar the scripts claimed he was. The production team went through stunt cars at an alarming rate, partly because of this constant front-end damage. Even when a car survived a jump well enough to drive away, the cosmetic damage to the nose and bumper often made it unusable for any close-up shots or scenes where KITT needed to look pristine and high-tech. This meant that what might have been a reusable stunt car after one jump often became scrap metal, simply because the front end looked too battered to pass for the sleek, undamaged KITT that television audiences expected to see. Fact 3. KITT was originally named T-A-T. Before the world's most famous talking car became known as KITT, the character had a completely different name that was much more straightforward and literally described exactly what kind of vehicle he was. In the early script development for Knight Rider, the car's acronym was originally going to be T-A-T-T, which stood for Trans Am 2000, and this name made perfect sense because the design was based entirely on the Pontiac Trans Am. The original naming approach was refreshingly direct and honest about what audiences would be seeing on their television screens. Since the show's creators had chosen the Pontiac Trans Am as their base vehicle and were setting the story in what was then the near future, calling the car Trans Am 2000 seemed like a logical way to indicate that this was an advanced, futuristic version of a car that viewers could recognize and relate to. The acronym T-A-T-T rolled off the tongue reasonably well and clearly identified the vehicle's origins without any confusion or mystery. However, as the show moved through development, the creators decided that they wanted something that sounded more distinctive and memorable than T-A-T-T. They eventually settled on K-I-T-T, which stood for Knight Industries 2000, and this change reflected a shift in how they wanted to present the car's fictional origins. Instead of focusing on the real-world Pontiac connection, the new name emphasized the show's fictional Knight Industries company and tied the vehicle more directly to the character of Wilton Knight, the billionaire who created both the foundation for law and government, and the advanced automobile that would become Michael Knight's partner. The change from T-A-T-T to K-I-T-T also had practical benefits for the show's marketing and merchandising potential. Knight Industries 2000 sounded more high-tech and futuristic than Trans Am 2000, and it gave the producers more creative freedom to invent fictional technologies and capabilities without being tied too closely to what a real Pontiac Trans Am could actually do. The name K-I-T-T also created a more personal, almost pet-like quality that made the car seem more like a character and less like a piece of equipment. Fact 4. The voice actor was never credited. One of the most distinctive elements of Knight Rider was KITT's sophisticated, sardonic voice, but the actor who brought the car to life remained completely anonymous throughout the show's entire 4-season run, because he specifically requested not to receive any credit for his work. William Daniels, who was already a well-established and respected actor, made the unusual decision to keep his involvement in Knight Rider a complete secret from television audiences, and this choice led to one of the strangest working relationships in television history. Daniels wanted to preserve what he called the mysticism of KITT's voice and maintain the illusion that the car truly had its own personality, rather than being voiced by a human actor. He believed that seeing his name in the credits would break the spell for viewers and remind them that they were watching a performance rather than interacting with an actual artificial intelligence. This decision was particularly remarkable because Daniels was simultaneously starring as Dr. Mark Craig on the critically acclaimed medical drama Saint Elsewhere, which aired on the same network during the same time period, so he was hardly trying to avoid public attention or hide his acting career. The secrecy extended far beyond just the credits, creating an almost absurd situation behind the scenes. Daniels and David Hasselhoff worked on the same show for months without ever meeting face-to-face, because Daniels would record all of KITT's dialogue separately after the main filming was completed. Hasselhoff would perform his scenes while listening to an assistant read KITT's lines, and when the car was supposed to be moving during dialogue, the lines would be fed to Hasselhoff through the car's stereo system. This bizarre arrangement continued until the production's Christmas party, 6 months after filming the first season, when Daniels and Hasselhoff finally met in person. Until that moment, Hasselhoff had never seen the face behind the voice that had become his character's most important relationship on the show. Despite Daniels' efforts to remain anonymous, his distinctive voice was so recognizable that fans figured out his identity almost immediately after the show premiered, making his request for secrecy somewhat pointless, but no less interesting. Fact 5. KITT's driver wore a seat cover. One of Knight Rider's most impressive visual effects was watching KITT speed into frame when Michael Knight summoned him, appearing to drive completely by himself with no human behind the wheel. The production team achieved this seemingly high-tech illusion using the most wonderfully low-tech solution imaginable. A stunt driver lying on the passenger floor wearing a Pontiac Firebird seat cover and a tan long-sleeve shirt that perfectly matched the car's interior. The challenge facing the Knight Rider crew was how to make KITT appear autonomous while still having someone actually control the vehicle safely. Self-driving cars were pure science fiction in 1982, so they needed a human driver who could remain completely invisible to the television cameras. The solution they came up with was both brilliant and slightly ridiculous, requiring the stunt driver to contort himself into an extremely uncomfortable position and essentially become part of the car's upholstery. The stunt driver would squeeze himself down onto the passenger side floor and extend his arms and legs through gaps in the seat to reach the steering wheel and pedals, all while wearing clothing that matched the car's tan interior perfectly. The seat cover he wore was designed to look exactly like the passenger seat's fabric, so if any part of him became visible to the camera, it would just blend in with the surrounding upholstery. This meant that from the driver's side of the car, it genuinely appeared as if no one was controlling the vehicle. The production team also created a special two-way mirror system that helped hide the driver during scenes where KITT was supposed to be operating solo, but they couldn't use this technique for extended periods because of how difficult and uncomfortable it was to film. If you watch the show very carefully and know what to look for, you can sometimes catch a glimpse of the hidden driver just as KITT comes to a screeching halt, right before the editors cut to footage showing the genuinely empty driver's seat. This simple but effective trick fooled millions of viewers and made KITT's self-driving capabilities seem completely believable. Fact 6. The theme song came from classical ballet. The pulsing, synthesizer-heavy Knight Rider theme that became one of the most recognizable television music pieces of the 1980s has its roots in a completely unexpected place. A 19th-century French ballet about Roman mythology. The iconic melody that accompanied KITT's adventures was based on Cortège de Bacchus, from the third act of Léo Delibes' ballet Sylvia, which premiered in 1876 at the Paris Opera, though there's an interesting controversy about whether this connection was intentional or purely coincidental. Glenn Larson, the show's creator, claimed in interviews that he remembered the melody from this classical piece and deliberately borrowed elements from it when working with composer Stu Phillips to create the Knight Rider theme. The ballet tells the story of Sylvia, a huntress devoted to the goddess Diana, and the Cortège de Bacchus section features a triumphant processional march for the Roman god of wine and celebration. The melodic structure and rhythmic patterns from this classical piece provided the foundation for what would become one of television's most memorable theme songs. However, composer Stu Phillips himself told a different story, insisting that any similarity between the Knight Rider theme and the Delibes ballet was purely accidental. Phillips maintained that he had never heard the classical piece and that the resemblance was just a remarkable coincidence. He explained that during the creative process, he and Larson were focused on creating something that would sound futuristic and exciting, using synthesizers, which the network had specifically requested to give the show a modern, high-tech feel. The network's push for synthesizer-heavy music was perfectly timed for the early 1980s, when electronic music was becoming increasingly popular and sophisticated. Larson and Phillips used 5 or 6 different synthesizers, along with drums and a Fender bass, to create the final theme, layering the sounds to build the driving, energetic piece that would introduce each episode. Whether intentional or accidental, the connection to classical ballet gives the Knight Rider theme an unexpectedly sophisticated pedigree that most fans never knew existed. Fact 7. Pontiac originally rejected the show. Before KITT became one of the most famous cars in television history and helped boost Pontiac Trans Am sales dramatically, the company's executives initially wanted nothing to do with Knight Rider because they thought the concept was ridiculous and would damage their brand image. Jim Graham, Pontiac's sales promotion manager at the time, flatly rejected the show when Universal Studios first approached the company, comparing it unfavorably to one of television's most notorious failures and worrying that association with the series would hurt rather than help Pontiac's reputation. Graham's main concern was that Knight Rider reminded him too much of My Mother the Car, a 1965 sitcom that had been universally panned by critics and quickly canceled after just one season. That show featured a man whose deceased mother's spirit inhabited his old car and communicated with him. And it was widely considered one of the worst television concepts ever produced. Graham saw disturbing similarities between a talking car show that had been a complete disaster and this new proposal about another talking car, and he didn't want Pontiac associated with what seemed destined to become another embarrassing flop. The rejection shocked Michael Dahlquist, a Hollywood vehicle coordinator who had successfully placed General Motors trucks in popular shows like The Rockford Files, Chipes, and The Fall Guy. Dahlquist had expected Pontiac to jump at the opportunity for the kind of exposure that Knight Rider would provide, especially since the Trans Am had been struggling with declining sales and could use the boost that a hit television show might provide. Fortunately for both Pontiac and Knight Rider fans, not everyone at the company shared Graham's pessimistic view of the project. Other executives at Pontiac recognized the potential marketing value of having their car featured as the high-tech hero of an action-adventure series, and they eventually overruled Graham's decision. The new Pontiac general manager Bill Hoagland told Dahlquist that while he wouldn't go against Graham directly, if Dahlquist could figure out how to get the cars into the show through other channels, Hoagland would sign off on any necessary paperwork to make it happen. Fact 8. Most cars came from a train wreck. The majority of cars that became KITT during Knight Rider's 4-season run came from an unexpected and dramatic source: a train derailment in California that occurred on November 11, 1982. Just as the show was beginning production and desperately needed more vehicles for all the stunts and action sequences that the scripts demanded, Universal Studios managed to acquire these damaged Pontiac Firebirds and Camaros for the incredibly low price of just $1 each. Though, this bargain came with a significant legal restriction that would later cause problems. The train had been carrying brand new cars from the factory to Pontiac dealerships across California when several freight cars loaded with Firebirds came off the tracks near Selma, California, just south of Fresno. Many of the cars had landed on their sides or suffered other damage during the derailment, which meant they could no longer be sold as new vehicles to regular customers. However, for a television production that was planning to crash, jump, and generally destroy cars on a regular basis, these damaged vehicles were actually perfect because they didn't need to be in pristine condition to serve as stunt cars. Michael Koch, who worked with the Knight Rider production team, heard about the train derailment and realized it was exactly the solution they needed. The show had already been struggling to get enough Trans Ams from Pontiac for all the action sequences planned in the scripts, and going back to ask for more new cars wasn't really an option after the initial negotiations had been so difficult. The derailed cars provided a steady supply of vehicles that could be modified into KITT replicas without the expense and complications of acquiring brand new automobiles. The The $1 price tag came with an important legal stipulation that would eventually become a problem for collectors and fans. The contract specified that these cars could never be sold to private individuals because of their train damage history, which meant they had to be completely destroyed when Universal Studios no longer needed them. This requirement led to most of the KITT cars being crushed at the end of filming, making the few surviving examples extremely rare and valuable to collectors today. Fact 9. The pilot's original star was replaced. Before David Hasselhoff became the face of Knight Rider and launched his career into international stardom, another actor named Larry Anderson was originally cast to play Michael Long in the pilot episode, but he was completely replaced during production in one of the most dramatic recasting decisions in television history. Anderson filmed his scenes as the detective who would eventually become Michael Knight, but the producers decided to replace him with Hasselhoff and then had to figure out how to salvage all the footage they had already shot with the wrong actor. The recasting created a unique challenge for the production team because they had already invested significant time and money filming Anderson's performance, and they couldn't afford to reshoot everything from scratch. Instead, they came up with an ingenious solution that allowed them to keep most of Anderson's footage while completely changing the character's voice and some key scenes. Hasselhoff was brought in to dub over every single line that Anderson had spoken, essentially replacing Anderson's entire vocal performance while keeping his physical presence in most of the scenes. The transition between actors happens during a pivotal moment in the pilot when Michael Long is shot in the face during an undercover operation in the Nevada desert. This traumatic injury provides the perfect story reason for the character to look and sound different when he recovers, since Wilton Knight arranges for extensive plastic surgery that gives Michael Long a completely new appearance and identity as Michael Knight. The scenes after the shooting were refilmed with Hasselhoff, but his face is kept hidden in darkness throughout these early appearances to maintain the mystery of his new look. Anderson's participation in this process was remarkably gracious, considering the circumstances. According to Hasselhoff's autobiography, Anderson was called to an audition late in the afternoon, got the role that same evening, and was on set filming the next day. When he was replaced, Anderson made the professional decision to remain uncredited for his work on the pilot, even though his physical performance appears throughout the episode. This unusual casting change created one of television's most seamless actor replacements, with most viewers never realizing that two different people played the same character. Fact 10. Patricia McPherson was fired for sex appeal. After Knight Rider's successful first season, the network made the controversial decision to fire Patricia McPherson, who played KITT's chief technician Bonnie Barstow, and replace her with Rebecca Holden, in an attempt to add what they considered more sex appeal to the show. This decision created significant tension behind the scenes and ultimately backfired when fans, cast members, and even the show's star rallied to bring McPherson back, making her one of the few actors in television history to be fired from a hit show and then successfully reinstated. Producer Robert Foster reportedly felt that McPherson's character was too cold and calculating, and didn't provide the kind of glamorous appeal that he thought the show needed to maintain its popularity. The network brought in Rebecca Holden, a former Breck shampoo model who had appeared in various television shows, to play April Curtis as Bonnie's replacement. Holden was certainly more conventionally glamorous than McPherson, and the show's second season opening credits made this change in direction obvious, featuring Holden working on KITT while wearing a tied-up blue blouse that emphasized her physical attributes rather than her technical expertise. However, this calculated attempt to boost the show's appeal through casting changes created an unexpected backlash. David Hasselhoff was reportedly furious about McPherson's firing and felt that it was both unfair to a talented actress and damaging to the show's chemistry. He began lobbying the producers and network executives to bring McPherson back, arguing that her character had been an important part of what made the show work. Edward Mulhauer, who played Devon Miles, also supported efforts to reverse the decision. The fan reaction was equally negative, with viewers expressing their displeasure about losing a character they had grown attached to during the first season. By the end of the second season, the combination of cast pressure, fan complaints, and perhaps the realization that the change hadn't improved, the show's ratings led the producers to bring McPherson back for the third season. Holden left the series, and McPherson returned as Bonnie Barstow, remaining with the show through its final season in 1986. Fact 11. Cars were destroyed at alarming rate. The production of Knight Rider went through Pontiac Trans Ams at a truly staggering pace, destroying an average of just under one complete car for every 2 to 3 episodes filmed, which meant the show was consuming between 4 and 9 real automobiles each season just to create the action sequences that made KITT seem indestructible. This rate of destruction was so extreme that it became one of the most expensive aspects of producing the series, and required constant planning to ensure they had enough vehicles to keep filming. The relentless destruction was driven by the show's commitment to spectacular stunt work that had become popular after the Dukes of Hazzard proved that audiences loved watching cars perform impossible jumps and crashes. Glenn Larson, Knight Rider's creator, had written numerous car jumps and other destructive stunts into his scripts, and each one of these sequences had the potential to completely destroy or seriously damage a vehicle. Unlike other shows that might use the same car for multiple episodes, Knight Rider's action-heavy format meant that cars were constantly being subjected to impacts, jumps, crashes, and other abuse that rendered them unusable for future filming. The production team had to maintain several different categories of vehicles to handle this constant destruction. They kept lightweight fiberglass stunt cars specifically designed for jumps, regular stunt cars for driving sequences and crashes, hero cars for close-up shots with the actors, and shell cars that were essentially empty bodies used for the most destructive scenes. Even with this careful planning and specialization, the sheer number of cars being destroyed meant that the production was constantly scrambling to acquire more vehicles and modify them into KITT replicas. The destruction rate was so high that it influenced major production decisions, including the arrangement with Pontiac and the later acquisition of the train-damaged cars. Each destroyed car represented not just the loss of the vehicle itself, but also the $18,000 worth of modifications needed to transform a regular Trans Am into KITT, making every crash or failed jump an expensive proposition that the producers had to carefully balance against the visual impact they were trying to achieve. Fact 12. The red light was inspired by Cylons. The most recognizable visual feature of KITT, the sweeping red light that moved back and forth across the front of the car, came directly from Glenn Larson's previous science fiction series and represented his desire to give the talking automobile what he described as a beating heart that would show audiences the car was truly alive. Larson took direct inspiration from the Cylon warriors in his hit show Battlestar Galactica, borrowing their distinctive scanning red eye effect and adapting it to work on an automobile instead of a robotic enemy. The Cylons in Battlestar Galactica were mechanical beings created as the primary antagonists of that series, and their most memorable feature was the horizontal red light that swept back and forth across their metallic faces, where human eyes would be located. This visual effect became iconic in science fiction, television, and immediately communicated to viewers that they were looking at artificial intelligence rather than human characters. When Larson began developing Knight Rider, he wanted a similar visual cue that would instantly tell audiences that KITT was more than just a regular car. Larson specifically asked designer Michael Sheffa to create a beam of light similar to what the Cylons had in Battlestar Galactica, but adapted for use on the front of a vehicle. The concept was that this moving light would serve as KITT's equivalent of a heartbeat or pulse, providing a constant visual reminder that the car possessed artificial intelligence and was essentially a living character rather than just a piece of machinery. The light needed to be prominent enough to be clearly visible in both daylight and nighttime scenes, and dramatic enough to capture viewers' attention every time KITT appeared on screen. The practical implementation required extending the Pontiac's nose slightly to accommodate the light bar and its housing, giving KITT a more distinctive appearance that set it apart from regular Trans Ams. The sweeping motion of the light was carefully timed to create a steady, rhythmic pulse that reinforced the idea of KITT as a sentient being. And this simple but effective visual element became so closely associated with the character that it appeared in every version and revival of Knight Rider that followed. Fact 13. KITT had rubber body shells. One of the most ingenious behind-the-scenes innovations that kept Knight Rider's production costs manageable was the creation of flexible rubber body shells that could be placed over the actual Trans Am bodies to protect valuable cars from damage during stunts, and these same rubber shells became the key component that allowed the production team to create their most unusual stunt vehicle. The rubber shells were designed to look exactly like KITT's distinctive bodywork, complete with all the visual details that made the car recognizable, but they could absorb impacts and scrapes that would have seriously damaged or destroyed the expensive modified Trans Ams underneath. The concept was both practical and economical, allowing the production team to use the same base vehicles for multiple types of scenes without constantly worrying about cosmetic damage that would make the cars unusable for close-up shots. When a script called for KITT to scrape against walls, drive through rough terrain, or perform other stunts that might scratch or dent the bodywork, the crew could simply place one of these protective rubber shells over a real Trans Am and film the sequence without risking permanent damage to the vehicle. After filming, they could remove the rubber shell, revealing an undamaged car that was ready for the next scene. The rubber shells proved to be even more versatile than originally intended when the production team realized they could use them to disguise completely different vehicles. The most dramatic example of this innovation was the creation of what the crew nicknamed the Flivver, which was essentially a Volkswagen Beetle-based sandrail that had been built to the exact dimensions of a Pontiac Trans Am. By placing one of the rubber KITT body shells over this lightweight, rugged chassis, they created a stunt vehicle that could handle the most dangerous and destructive sequences without destroying expensive Trans Ams. The rubber shells were so convincing that television audiences never suspected they were looking at anything other than the real KITT, even when the car underneath was actually a completely different type of vehicle. This deception was made possible by the limited resolution of 1980s television technology and the skill of the craftspeople who created shells that perfectly matched every detail of KITT's appearance. Fact 14. 2 actors played the same character. The Knight Rider pilot episode contains one of the most seamless casting substitutions in television history, where 2 completely different actors played the same character in the same episode without most viewers ever noticing the switch. An actor was called late in the afternoon for an audition, received word that evening that he had gotten the role, and appeared on set the very next day to begin filming. But David Hasselhoff later took over the character and dubbed over all of the original actor's dialogue to create a performance that combined 2 people into one seamless portrayal. This unusual situation occurred during a critical transition scene where the character undergoes a dramatic transformation that provided the perfect cover for the actor replacement. The original actor filmed several scenes, but when the production team decided to replace him with Hasselhoff, they faced the challenge of how to make this change work within the story they had already begun filming. The solution was both creative and practical, taking advantage of a pivotal moment in the narrative where the character's appearance would logically change. The replacement was handled so skillfully that the transition appears completely natural within the context of the story. Hasselhoff took over the role during scenes where the character's face needed to remain hidden, and these sequences were deliberately filmed with the character kept in darkness throughout. To maintain the mystery and avoid any jarring visual inconsistencies, This lighting choice served the dual purpose of building dramatic tension while concealing the fact that a different actor was now playing the same role. The original actor's mouth movements and Hasselhoff's dubbed dialogue didn't always match perfectly, which created some subtle synchronization issues that careful viewers might notice, but the overall effect was convincing enough that most audiences accepted the performance without question. The original actor chose not to be credited for his work in the pilot, making this one of the most professional and gracious examples of an actor handling an unexpected recasting situation in television production history. Fact 15. The running gag was filler content. One of the most memorable comedic elements from Knight Rider's pilot episode, the recurring scenes of two bumbling car thieves attempting to steal KITT, was never part of the original script and only existed because the producers discovered they had a serious timing problem after completing their first cut of the 2-hour television movie. When the editors finished assembling all the footage they had shot, they realized the pilot was 7 minutes too short to fill the required time slot, forcing them to quickly create additional content that could be inserted without disrupting the main storyline. The solution they came up with was both economical and entertaining, creating a series of short comic vignettes that could be sprinkled throughout the pilot to reach the necessary runtime without requiring expensive reshoots of major scenes or complicated new storylines involving the main characters. The car thief sequences were perfect for this purpose because they could be filmed quickly and cheaply with just 2 actors and the KITT car, and they provided moments of levity that balanced the more serious dramatic elements of the pilot's main plot. These scenes featured 2 would-be criminals who repeatedly tried to break into and steal what they thought was just an expensive sports car, only to be thwarted by KITT's advanced security systems and artificial intelligence. The thieves would approach the car with typical criminal confidence, attempt to break in using conventional methods, and then be surprised and frustrated when KITT would respond with various defensive measures or sarcastic comments that sent them running away in confusion and fear. The running gag worked so well as filler material that it actually enhanced the pilot episode by providing comic relief and demonstrating KITT's capabilities in a lighthearted way that helped establish the show's tone. What began as a practical solution to a timing problem became one of the most quoted and remembered sequences from the pilot, showing how sometimes the best creative decisions emerge from solving basic production challenges rather than elaborate planning and scripting.